It started like any other day, the kind of day that feels so ordinary you don't expect anything unusual to happen. The sky was still soft with morning light, and the air felt cool, carrying that calm stillness that usually comes before the world fully wakes up. The main person in this story, let's call him simply he, because his name doesn't matter as much as what he went through, stepped out of his small house with the same routine he had followed for years. He lived in a quiet neighborhood where everyone knew everyone. People greeted each other with a smile. Children ran around in the streets after school, and most houses had small gardens out front. It was the sort of place where a person could leave their door unlocked during the day and not worry. And he loved that. He loved the familiarity of it, the simplicity, the warmth, the comfort of knowing the world around him. His days were simple. He worked at a nearby workshop, fixing things that others had thrown away. He enjoyed using his hands, turning broken items into something useful again. His coworkers respected him, not because he was the loudest or the strongest, but because he was steady. He listened more than he spoke, but when he spoke, people listened. He had a calmness about him that made others trust him instantly. At home, he lived with a small family, nothing too big, nothing too dramatic. They had their little problems, just like any family, but they cared about each other deeply. In the evenings, they shared meals together, talked about their day, and sometimes sat outside to enjoy the cool air. Life was simple, but it was good, and he believed it would stay that way. But over the past few weeks, something had started to shift. It wasn't loud or obvious at first. It was small things, whispers, rumors, small stories, traded between neighbors in low voices. People said there were outsiders coming into the area with strange attitudes. They weren't exactly dangerous, but they had a habit of acting as though they owned the streets. They spoke loudly, pushed their weight around, and made some neighbors uncomfortable. Still, many people thought it was nothing. It will pass, they said. They won't stay long. Even he believed that. He was not someone who jumped to conclusions. He liked to see the good in people first. But some part of him deep inside could sense something wasn't right. One evening, he came home later than usual. The workshop had been busy, and by the time he finished cleaning up, the sun had already dipped behind the rooftops. When he entered the neighborhood, he noticed a small group of people standing at the corner of the street. They were not from the area. He had never seen them before. They were loud, laughing in a way that didn't feel friendly. The laughter wasn't joyful. It was sharp, like they were laughing at someone, not with someone. He walked past them slowly, not wanting any trouble. He kept his head low, but not too low, the way someone cautious but confident would. He wasn't afraid, but he didn't want to invite attention. Still, he could feel their eyes on him. He didn't turn around. He just kept walking until he reached his house. When he stepped inside, his family noticed his uneasiness. They asked if everything was all right, and he nodded. He didn't want to worry them. He told himself it was nothing. Maybe it really was nothing. But the feeling stayed with him, a small weight in his stomach that refused to disappear. The next morning, as he walked to work, he met a neighbor sweeping the front of her house. She seemed nervous. She stopped sweeping and leaned a little closer to him. "Did you see them last night?" she asked quietly. He nodded. "They were here again early this morning," she continued. "Shouting, arguing with someone. I'm not sure what they want, but it doesn't look good." He thanked her for telling him and continued on his way. Throughout the day, he kept thinking about her words. What did they want? Why were they hanging around a peaceful neighborhood like his? He had no answers, and the confusion bothered him more than he expected. When he returned home later, he noticed a few more neighbors standing outside, talking in hushed voices. They stopped when he approached, and one of them pulled him aside. "There was an incident today," the neighbor said. "Nothing serious, but they bothered a delivery worker. Stopped him in the street. Asked strange questions. They're trying to provoke something." He listened carefully. He didn't react with anger or fear. Instead, he simply observed. He believed that reacting too quickly only made things worse. But inside, something began to shift. A quiet alertness. A readiness he had never needed before. That night, as he sat with his family, he couldn't shake the thought that something big was coming. Something that wouldn't be easy to ignore. He noticed the worry in his family's eyes, too. They didn't say it directly, but he could feel their silent questions floating in the air. Should we be worried? Is something going to happen? Will everything be okay? He had no answers yet, but he knew he needed to stay calm. Fear spreads faster than truth, and he didn't want fear to take over their home. Days passed. The strangers in the neighborhood became more bold. People saw them, leaning against walls, walking slowly up and down the street, stopping random people for no reason. They weren't doing anything extremely harmful, but their presence was unsettling, like a shadow that follows your every step. He tried to continue his routine, but even he couldn't deny that the air had changed. When he walked to work, he heard people whispering. When he returned home, he saw groups of neighbors gathering outside to talk. Everyone felt the tension, even if no one wanted to be the first to speak it aloud. One afternoon, something happened that finally made him stop pretending everything was normal. He was returning from the workshop when he saw two of the strangers, standing very close to one of the elderly neighbors. She looked uncomfortable, clutching her shopping bag tightly. They weren't touching her, but they were cornering her with their words speaking loudly, making gestures that felt threatening even from a distance. He didn't jump in or shout. Instead, he approached calmly, like he always did. "Is everything all right?" he asked gently. The elderly neighbor looked relieved the moment she saw him. She quickly said she needed to head home. The strangers stared at him, not saying anything at first. Their eyes held a challenge, a silent test. But he didn't give them anything back, not fear, not anger, not weakness. He simply stood there, steady, grounded. After a few seconds, they stepped aside, letting the woman pass. He walked her home, making sure she reached her door safely. She thanked him quietly, her hands trembling a little. That moment stayed with him long after he reached his own house. It wasn't the encounter itself, it was the feeling behind it. The strangers weren't looking for friendship. They weren't simply passing through. They were pushing, testing, looking for reactions, looking for a reason to escalate. It was the moment he knew things were going to change. He didn't know how or when or in what way, but he felt it deep inside. The peace of the neighborhood, the quiet mornings, the simple evenings, something was threatening all of it. Later that night, he sat outside alone, watching the street. The air was still, but the calm felt fragile, like thin glass that could break with the slightest pressure. He thought about his neighborhood, his family, his life. He wasn't someone who looked for trouble, but he wasn't someone who ran from responsibility either. He took a deep breath and told himself something he hadn't said before. If this becomes a battle, we won't face it alone. He didn't know it yet, but that thought would become the beginning of everything that followed. It was the quiet spark before the storm, the moment when an ordinary person realizes that sometimes life doesn't ask for heroes. It creates them. And the days ahead would test every bit of strength he didn't even know he had. The next few days felt heavier than usual. Even though the sun still rose the same way, and people still went to work, something in the air had changed. It was like the whole neighborhood was holding its breath, waiting for something they didn't want to face. And the strangers who had appeared recently were no longer just passing figures. They had become a part of the daily scenery, unwanted, but impossible to ignore. He noticed them every time he stepped outside. They were always in small groups, sometimes sitting on corners, sometimes walking slowly up and down the street as if inspecting everything. They didn't smile at anyone, didn't greet anyone, and didn't behave the way visitors normally would. They acted like they were trying to send a message, and even though no one wanted to say it aloud, everyone could feel it. One morning, he walked to the workshop as usual, but the street felt different. The children who used to play outside before school were now waiting inside their gates. The older neighbors peeked through curtains instead of sitting on their porches. Even the shop owners, who normally opened their shutters with cheerful chatter, worked quietly, glancing at the road every few seconds. He paused for a moment on his way and looked around. It was strange how quickly a peaceful place could feel tense. He wondered how long the neighbors could tolerate this uneasiness before something had to change. When he reached the workshop, he tried to focus on his work. Fixing things always helped. Clear his mind. It brought a quiet rhythm, something steady, something predictable. But that day, even the familiar sound of tools couldn't stop his thoughts from drifting back to what was happening outside. Around midday, one of his coworkers approached him. The man looked uneasy, wiping his hands on a cloth, even though they weren't dirty. "Did you hear what happened earlier?" he asked. He shook his head, waiting silently for more. "They stopped someone again," his coworker said. "This time near the main road. Just asking strange questions. Nothing serious, but it's getting worse." He listened without interrupting. People didn't need long speeches. Sometimes they just needed to say what they felt so they didn't explode inside. "Everyone is scared," the coworker added, lowering his voice. "I don't know what they want." He didn't either. But he knew one thing for sure. Whatever the strangers wanted, it wasn't good. When the day ended, he walked home slowly, noticing everything around him as if he were seeing it for the first time. The streets that once felt friendly now carried a quiet warning. The corner where kids used to buy snacks from the small shop was empty. The benches near the park were deserted. Even the birds seemed quieter. And then, as he turned the last corner toward his house, he saw something that made him stop. The strangers were gathered again. Not many, just 3 or 4, but this time they looked more confident, almost proud. They were standing near an intersection where people usually passed on their way home. They weren't doing anything outright dangerous, but they were blocking the path, forcing anyone who wanted to cross to go around them. A delivery worker on a bicycle slowed down when he approached them. He didn't want trouble. He kept his head down and tried to find a space to pass. But they stepped in the way, making him stop completely. They asked him questions he clearly didn't know how to answer. They weren't hurting him, but their tone carried a kind of mockery, as if they enjoyed watching him feel uncomfortable. The worker looked around helplessly, hoping someone would help. A couple of people noticed, but quickly walked past, pretending not to see anything. They were afraid. Nobody could blame them. He felt a heavy pressure in his chest. He didn't want to step in recklessly, but he also couldn't walk away. Something inside him refused to let fear win, not for himself, and not for the people living around him. So he approached calmly, keeping his voice steady and polite. "Is everything okay here?" The delivery worker instantly looked relieved, almost as if someone had opened a window in a suffocating room. The strangers, however, turned toward him with slow, deliberate movements. Their expressions didn't change, but their eyes narrowed slightly, as if trying to figure out what kind of person he was. He didn't challenge them. He didn't raise his voice. He simply placed himself between them and the delivery worker, becoming a quiet shield without acting heroic or dramatic. After a few seconds, the strangers stepped aside, not out of respect, but out of curiosity. As if they were studying him, He guided the delivery worker to continue on his way. The worker whispered a thank you before riding off quickly. He didn't look back at the strangers. Instead, he walked home, feeling the weight of their stares on his back. It wasn't fear he felt. It was awareness. A sharp, growing awareness that things were reaching a dangerous point. When he entered his house, his family sensed his tension immediately. They asked what happened, and he told them the bare minimum. He didn't want to scare them, but he didn't want to lie either. Later that evening, neighbors gathered outside in small groups. Nobody wanted to say the word trouble, but it hung in the air like a thick fog. People spoke softly, looking over their shoulders more than usual. They asked the same questions again and again. Why are they here? What do they want? Why aren't they going away? Is someone going to do something? No one had answers. But then something surprising happened. A few people looked at him. Not because he was the strongest or the most outspoken, but because they had seen the way he stood up earlier without creating a scene. To them, he represented calmness. Someone who wouldn't panic, someone who wouldn't escalate things, someone who could take a stand without making the situation worse. One neighbor stepped closer to him and said in a quiet voice, "We need someone like you to help us stay united." He felt the weight of those words. He never saw himself as a leader. He was just an ordinary person trying to live an ordinary life. But sometimes life chooses someone before they choose themselves. That night, he thought long and hard. He wasn't looking for a fight. He didn't want conflict. But he couldn't ignore what was happening. If nobody stood up, the strangers would only grow bolder. And that would make things worse for everyone. He realized something important. Silence encourages fear, but unity encourages strength. The next morning, he woke up earlier than usual. He stepped outside and saw a few neighbors doing the same. Something was shifting, not dangerously, but quietly. People were tired of living in fear. They didn't want to hide behind curtains or lock themselves inside during the day. One of the neighbors approached him and said, almost in a whisper, "We're with you, whatever you decide." He nodded slowly. He didn't promise anything grand. He simply said, "We'll talk. We'll stay together." That's the first step. Throughout the day, more neighbors shared small gestures of support. A nod, a soft smile, a gentle pat on the arm. Ordinary people who had spent their lives minding their own business were now forming an invisible bond, and the strangers had no idea a quiet resistance was building. By evening, he sensed something new in the air, not fear, not tension, but a kind of determination. People were tired of being pushed around. They weren't angry. They were simply done being afraid. For the first time in days, he felt a small spark of hope. He knew the strangers would return. He knew they would try again. But now, the neighborhood wasn't standing alone. They were watching. They were alert. And most importantly, they were united. He didn't know what the next days would bring. But he knew one thing for certain. The strangers wanted a reaction. They wanted a battle. They wanted chaos. But what they would soon face was something far stronger. People who were done being silent. People who were waking up. People ready to stand together. And the strangers had no idea how powerful that could be. The neighborhood began to feel different that week. The quiet tension that had been holding everyone back was slowly starting to turn into something else, a sense that maybe they could face the problem together. People had begun to notice each other in ways they hadn't before. Simple gestures like nodding to someone across the street, offering a cup of water to the delivery worker, or sharing a small smile carried more weight than ever. These small moments built connections, little bridges between hearts that fear had almost separated. He noticed it first one morning when he stepped outside. A few neighbors were standing near the corner, chatting quietly, but there was no trace of worry on their faces. There was a calm, steady energy in the air. Even though the strangers had been present again that night, moving slowly through the streets, people were no longer hiding behind curtains or fences. They were simply there, calmly going about their day. He walked past them and exchanged greetings, something that would have seemed ordinary a week ago. The feeling that came back from those nods and smiles surprised him. It felt like solidarity. People were not just observing him now. They were quietly recognizing that they could rely on one another. That morning, he decided to visit some of the neighbors who had been particularly quiet before, those who usually stayed indoors or avoided speaking up. He started with a small family whose home had always been full of laughter, but who had withdrawn over the past few weeks. He knocked lightly, and the door opened just a crack. "Can we talk?" he asked gently. They hesitated, glancing at each other, but then the door opened wider, and he stepped inside. They didn't need to speak loudly. Their eyes showed that they understood what had been happening, the tension, the fear, the uncertainty. He explained calmly that they didn't have to face the strangers alone, that they could rely on neighbors, that even small acts like watching the street together, checking in with one another, and staying alert could make a huge difference. By the time he left, the family was nodding, even smiling softly. He realized then that courage didn't always need to be loud or heroic. Sometimes it was a quiet willingness to be there for others. That evening, he gathered with a few neighbors. At the small park in the center of the neighborhood, there were maybe 10 of them, not a crowd, but enough to make a difference. He didn't stand on a platform or give speeches. He simply spoke plainly, sharing what he had noticed, sharing what he thought could help, and listening to what they had to say. Everyone contributed. One neighbor offered to keep an eye on the corner where the strangers usually appeared. Another said they would take turns checking the streets in the mornings. Someone else suggested leaving small lights on in the evenings to make sure every corner was visible. Every small idea mattered. Every voice mattered. It was the first time he saw the strength that came from shared effort. It wasn't about one person being brave. It was about everyone being willing to do something, however small, to protect the place they loved. The energy in the park felt different, warm, alive, and steady. Over the next few days, the neighborhood began changing in small but noticeable ways. People were no longer retreating into their homes when they saw the strangers. The kids started playing outside again, cautiously at first, but eventually with laughter returning. Shopkeepers smiled at each other and exchanged friendly words, checking on each other more than ever. Even the delivery workers seemed lighter, more confident as they passed through the streets. He noticed that the strangers were still there, still walking slowly up and down the streets, still watching. But something had shifted. They no longer had the same effect. People didn't run or hide anymore. Instead, they kept going about their routines, aware of the strangers, alert but calm. One afternoon, he noticed a stranger approaching an elderly neighbor who was walking slowly with her cane. The stranger moved toward her in that familiar, uncomfortable way. But this time, she didn't freeze. She continued walking steadily, and he happened to be nearby. Without speaking harshly or raising his voice, he stepped between them and simply guided the stranger aside with a calm but firm presence. The elderly neighbor thanked him quietly and continued her way home. He felt a sense of relief, not just for her, but for the neighborhood itself. Everyone was learning that fear could be confronted, not with anger, but with calm strength, with unity. Later that evening, he met a group of neighbors on the small square near the park. They were talking quietly but confidently. They shared stories of small victories, a stranger who had stepped back when approached, a child who had walked home safely, someone who had helped a neighbor carry groceries. Every story reinforced the idea that they weren't helpless, that they weren't alone. He realized something important during that gathering. The strangers were powerful only as long as people allowed them to be. Their presence, their attempts to intimidate, had depended on fear. Remove the fear, and the power shifted. The next morning, he woke up early and walked the streets, noticing the changes himself. People were emerging from their homes earlier, smiling, greeting each other, exchanging small acts of kindness. The streets were alive again, but this time with awareness. He could see the beginnings of a community that was awake, alert, and willing to act together if needed. He didn't need to tell anyone what to do. People were already choosing to protect each other in small ways. The young people helped older neighbors carry bags. The adults checked on each other when they saw someone walking alone. And even children learned to watch the street and alert adults if something unusual happened. It wasn't about grand gestures or heroism. It was about quiet, persistent care. It was about ordinary people standing together, learning to notice, and learning to support each other without panic or aggression. One afternoon, he stopped by the corner where the strangers often gathered. They were there, as expected, walking slowly and watching the street. But this time, something was different. The neighbors were standing calmly, observing from across the road. They didn't shout, they didn't provoke, and they didn't run. They simply stayed alert at the strangers, looked around, realizing that they no longer had the same effect. People weren't afraid anymore. The quiet unity of the neighborhood was stronger than the sharp presence of the strangers. For the first time, he saw confusion in their expressions. They didn't know how to react to ordinary people standing calmly together. That evening, he returned home and watched the sun set over the rooftops. The warmth of the fading light felt like a small promise that the neighborhood could survive this challenge, that people could protect each other, that unity was stronger than intimidation. He realized that strength didn't have to be loud. Courage didn't have to be dramatic. Even ordinary people, quietly working together, could change the way things happened. And more than that, they could inspire others to do the same. By the end of the week, the neighborhood felt alive again. Fear was no longer the main force guiding their actions. People smiled, they spoke to each other, and they took small steps to make sure everyone felt safe. The strangers were still around, but their power had weakened. The invisible bond among the neighbors had grown stronger than the shadow of fear. He understood something essential by now. Fear could always be present, but it didn't have to control life. What mattered was human connection, awareness, and the willingness to act together. The strangers had wanted a reaction, but the neighborhood had chosen something else: calm strength and quiet unity. And in that calm, there was a kind of energy that the strangers could not understand. It was the energy of people who cared for each other, people who were willing to protect each other in simple human ways, people who had discovered that when humans come together, ordinary life can become extraordinary. He went to bed that night, feeling a sense of purpose he had never felt before. He didn't see himself as a hero, and he didn't need to. What mattered was that the neighborhood had found its courage, and that courage was quiet, steady, and human. It wasn't loud, it wasn't flashy, and it didn't depend on violence. It depended on people noticing each other, helping each other, and standing together, even in small ways. He realized, as he drifted off to sleep, that the strangers had underestimated something very powerful. They had underestimated humanity. The days that followed brought a quiet sense of confidence to the neighborhood. It wasn't loud or dramatic, but it was noticeable. People walked a little taller, exchanged smiles a little more freely, and helped each other without thinking twice. Even the youngest children, who once clung nervously to their parents' hands, were beginning to explore the streets with small, careful steps As if they could sense the change to dot, he started each morning with a walk, observing the small signs of life. The baker had left fresh bread outside the shop for early risers. A neighbor had put out chairs so people could sit and talk without huddling behind fences. Small gestures, but they carried enormous weight. The energy of the neighborhood was no longer just survival. It was hope. Yet the strangers hadn't gone away. They were still there, moving slowly through the streets, lingering near corners, and glancing at anyone who looked like they might challenge them. Their presence was still unsettling, but it had lost its power. People no longer shrank when they saw them. They kept walking, kept speaking to one another, and most importantly, kept noticing what was happening. One afternoon, he saw the strangers gathered near the park where children were playing. For a moment, he felt the old tension rise in his chest. But then he noticed something different. He wasn't alone. A small group of neighbors had stepped forward quietly, not shouting, not threatening, just standing together. Their expressions were calm, alert, and firm. It was a simple act, but it sent a clear message. The neighborhood was watching, and they were ready. He approached the group, and together they formed a quiet presence that seemed to stretch across the park. The strangers hesitated, unsure how to act. They tried walking slowly past, but every step was met with steady eyes and calm awareness. The energy of the neighborhood was no longer hidden. It was visible, quiet, and strong. After a few moments, the strangers moved on, leaving the park. The children continued playing as if nothing had happened, their laughter louder than ever. Parents and neighbors exchanged quiet smiles, realizing that fear no longer dictated their actions. It was a small victory, but it felt enormous. Later that evening, he gathered a larger group of neighbors in the square. They didn't speak of anger or revenge. They spoke of preparedness, awareness, and support. They discussed simple plans, taking turns walking the streets, watching for unusual behavior, checking in on neighbors, and ensuring that children could play safely. Every idea was practical, grounded, and human-centered. What struck him most was how ordinary the people were who were contributing. There were no leaders, no heroes, just neighbors willing to care for each other. Each person added a layer of strength simply by being present, paying attention, and acting calmly. It was a quiet form of power, but one that felt unstoppable. Over the next few days, life began to settle into a new rhythm. People greeted each other more openly, children played freely, and even the busiest streets felt alive with careful confidence. He noticed that the strangers' movements became less threatening. They lingered less, spoke to fewer people, and seemed to sense that their influence was fading. One morning, as he walked toward the corner where the strangers often appeared, he saw them stop and watch him. But he didn't flinch. Instead, he kept walking steadily, nodding to a neighbor along the way. The strangers exchanged glances and then moved on. It was a small moment, but it carried a silent message. The neighborhood had changed. He returned home and shared the day's observations with his family. They didn't speak in dramatic terms, but they smiled and nodded, understanding that life was slowly returning to normal. It wasn't perfect, and the strangers could still cause discomfort, but the balance had shifted. The neighborhood had learned something essential. Calm, steady unity could withstand pressure better than fear or aggression ever could. As the week progressed, he noticed another change. People were beginning to help each other without being asked. One neighbor carried groceries for another who had injured their leg. A small group cleared the streets after a storm, working together without complaint. Even children looked out for each other, reminding their friends to stay close and helping younger ones across uneven pavements. Every action reinforced the quiet strength that had begun to grow in the community. He realized that the strangers had underestimated something they could never control: human connection. They might have come seeking intimidation, but the neighborhood had responded in a way that was powerful yet simple, by noticing, supporting, and protecting each other. Their attempts to create fear had been met with something far stronger: trust, care, and quiet. Vigilance. One evening, as he walked toward the park, he saw a stranger linger near a corner. For the first time, the stranger appeared unsure, hesitant. He didn't confront them aggressively. He didn't shout or make threats. He simply walked, with calm purpose, showing that the neighborhood was awake, alert, and united. The stranger glanced around, then moved away, disappearing down the street. That night, he reflected on the day. Courage didn't always roar. Sometimes it was quiet. Sometimes it was as simple as showing up, paying attention, and standing alongside. Others without panic or anger. The neighborhood had discovered that strength wasn't about dominance. It was about connection. It was about ordinary people noticing what mattered, acting with care, and refusing to be intimidated. Over the next few days, the stranger's presence became less frequent. They still appeared at times, but their attempts to unsettle the neighborhood no longer had the same impact. Children played in the streets, neighbors greeted each other warmly, and the small park once again became a place of laughter and conversation. He noticed that the quiet power of the neighborhood was growing. People were no longer just surviving, they were participating. They looked out for each other, offered help without being asked, and shared a sense of responsibility that stretched across every corner. It wasn't a force to fear or fight. It was a force to trust and nurture. One afternoon, he gathered a group of neighbors near the square to discuss small improvements. They spoke about lighting the streets better, checking in with those who lived alone, and creating a simple plan for emergencies. Nothing was dramatic, nothing was aggressive, but every idea contributed to the invisible strength of the neighborhood. It was a reminder that courage wasn't always about bold gestures. Sometimes it was small acts repeated over time. It was neighbors talking to each other, watching out for each other, and refusing to let fear dominate daily life. By the end of the week, the strangers seemed almost out of place. They moved more slowly, observed more carefully, and avoided interacting with the neighborhood. The people had learned that attention, unity, and calm strength were far more powerful than intimidation. They had discovered that when humans care for one another, they can face almost anything without violence or drama. He realized that the most important lesson wasn't about the strangers at all. It was about people noticing each other, taking small steps to help, and standing together, without letting fear take control. That quiet, steady vigilance created a sense of security that no external force could easily break. As he watched the sun set over the rooftops, he felt a quiet satisfaction. The neighborhood wasn't perfect, and challenges would still arise. But the foundation had been laid. Ordinary people had discovered an extraordinary truth. They were stronger together than apart, and human care was more powerful than intimidation. That night, the streets were alive with a soft energy. Windows glowed with warm lights, conversations drifted across fences, and the laughter of children carried into the evening. The strangers had become a reminder of something far more important: the power of ordinary people standing together. He understood now that battles weren't always fought with noise or aggression. Sometimes battles were won quietly, through attention, care, and the simple act of refusing to let fear dominate life. The strangers had wanted tension, confusion, and fear, but the neighborhood had given them something they could not measure or control: human unity. And in that unity, there was a power far greater than any stranger could imagine. The days had started to feel different. The quiet tension that once dominated the neighborhood had been replaced by a steady energy, an energy that came from people noticing each other, caring for each other, and standing together. But even in that calm, he knew the strangers were still around. Their presence was no longer intimidating, but it was persistent, like a shadow that never quite disappeared. He began each day with a walk through the streets, observing small signs of life and care. Children were playing in the yards and on the sidewalks, calling to one another, sharing games, and laughing freely. Adults were talking with neighbors as they worked in their gardens, checked mailboxes, or carried groceries. Even strangers passing through the neighborhood could sense the quiet strength that had formed. But today felt different. There was a restlessness in the air, a subtle awareness that something might happen. He noticed a few strangers lingering near the park longer than usual. They moved slowly, their eyes scanning, their posture deliberate, almost calculating. This time he wasn't alone. The neighbors had begun organizing in small groups. They were not planning anything dramatic. There were no weapons, no aggressive strategies. Their plan was simple: watch, support, and protect each other calmly. They had divided responsibilities, rotated patrols, and agreed to check on each other, especially the most vulnerable members of the neighborhood. Even the children were aware, taught to stay inside of adults and report anything unusual. He met the group at the square near the park, a place that had become a central point for communication. Today, there were more people than usual. Some older adults who had once hidden indoors, young adults who had taken on quiet leadership roles, and families who now walked together as a unit. Everyone was alert but calm, knowing that their unity was their strongest defense. The strangers were watching, but the neighborhood was ready. It was an invisible tension, the kind that comes before a storm, but this time it felt different. It wasn't fear, it was readiness. People had learned to rely on each other, to trust each other, and to act with quiet strength instead of panic. One neighbor noticed a stranger moving toward a narrow street where children often played. Instead of shouting, calling for help, or panicking, a small group calmly walked to intercept the stranger. They didn't confront aggressively. They simply made their presence known, standing together as a single, quiet force. The stranger paused, glanced at the group, and hesitated. There was no anger in the neighbors' faces, only calm awareness. The children, sensing the adults' confidence, stayed nearby without running. Slowly, the stranger changed direction and walked away. It was a small victory, but it carried immense weight. Later, he joined a meeting in one of the larger homes in the neighborhood. The group discussed what had happened that afternoon and planned for the days ahead. They didn't speak about revenge or conflict. They spoke about attention, preparedness, and care. Stay aware, stay calm, he said. If we act together, there's no need for fear. Just look out for each other and trust that we are stronger as a group. Other neighbors added ideas, keeping lights on during evening hours, sharing updates about unusual movements, and ensuring that everyone had someone checking in on them regularly. Even the smallest acts mattered: covering windows, carrying groceries for a neighbor, or simply walking together in pairs. Over the next few days, the neighborhood began to function like a quiet, coordinated team. It wasn't military. It wasn't aggressive. It was human. People looked out for one another, noticing small details and quietly adjusting their routines. Children learned which streets were safe and which streets needed extra attention. Adults shared observations and acted calmly if anything seemed unusual. The strangers noticed the change too. They moved less boldly, lingered less often, and seemed uncertain about the neighborhood's response. Their attempts to intimidate had lost their effect. People were no longer reacting with fear. They were responding with calm awareness and quiet unity. One evening, as he walked through the park, he saw the strangers again. They had gathered near the benches, watching. But the neighborhood was prepared. Adults and older teens had organized a subtle presence walking in small groups, talking quietly, making their awareness known without confrontation. Even the children were present, playing nearby, their laughter confident and natural. The strangers looked around, scanning the streets, but they hesitated. The calm energy of the neighborhood was impossible to ignore. They had expected panic or avoidance, but instead they found quiet strength. Slowly they moved along, leaving the park and the neighborhood intact. That night he walked home and reflected on what had happened. The strangers had wanted to create fear, to make people retreat into their homes and isolate themselves. But the neighborhood had responded differently. They had created an invisible shield of human connection, awareness, and care. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't violent, and it didn't need to be. It was simple, steady, and remarkably strong. Over the next days, he noticed a growing sense of confidence among everyone. The children played without hesitation. Adults engaged in daily tasks without distraction or fear. Even the older neighbors who had once been hesitant to leave their homes were now stepping outside, offering assistance to those who needed it, and taking part in the quiet watchfulness that kept everyone safe. He also noticed something deeper happening. People were learning to trust themselves and each other in ways they hadn't before. Fear had been replaced with awareness and panic, with patience. The energy of the neighborhood was not just about defense, it was about life. It was about sharing, noticing, and participating in something bigger than any one person. One afternoon, he observed a stranger approaching a narrow street where several families were walking. This time, he didn't need to act alone. The neighbors were already there, quietly forming a presence that was impossible to ignore. They didn't shout, they didn't threaten. They simply stood together, moving naturally but steadily, showing that they were present, aware, and united. The stranger hesitated again, scanning the calm faces, the children playing nearby, and the adults standing in quiet vigilance. Slowly, with no dramatic exit, they turned and left. It was as simple as that, yet it marked a profound change. That evening, the neighborhood gathered in the square once more. They spoke quietly, celebrating small victories and reinforcing the importance of unity and care. No one claimed heroism, everyone simply acknowledged that ordinary actions, repeated with consistency and attention, had made the difference. He realized that the strangers had underestimated something they could never measure: human connection. They had believed that intimidation and presence alone could control others. But the neighborhood had shown that courage was not loud or aggressive. Courage was calm. Courage was steady. Courage was human. By the end of the week, the neighborhood felt almost transformed. Fear no longer dictated movements, decisions, or interactions. The streets were alive with life, children's laughter, and quiet conversation. People looked out for one another in ways that were both natural and powerful. Even the strangers' rare appearances no longer caused tension. They had become reminders of how far the community had come. He walked through the streets one evening, noticing every small sign of life. Lights in windows, laughter drifting from gardens, neighbors exchanging nods and smiles. All of it spoke of something larger than fear. It spoke of resilience, care, and the extraordinary strength of ordinary people. He understood now that the coming days would test them further, but he felt a deep confidence. The neighborhood had discovered a truth: unity, awareness, and human care were stronger than intimidation. They were not invincible, but they were unshakable in the ways that truly mattered. And in that quiet, calm preparation, he realized that whatever came next, they would face it together. Not with anger, not with fear, but with human strength, connection, and quiet courage. The days had grown quieter, but the calm was not empty. It was full of life, movement, and cautious attention. Children ran freely, adults worked together, and neighbors greeted one another with warm smiles. Yet, beneath the normal rhythm, there was a shared awareness. The strangers could return at any moment. He walked through the streets early that morning, noticing the small signs of care everywhere. A neighbor had fixed a broken fence so the children could play safely. Another had carried groceries for someone who had trouble walking. Even the simplest gestures carried weight. They were proof that the neighborhood's strength wasn't built on fear. It was built on ordinary, consistent care. By mid-morning, a small crowd had gathered near the central square. They were not there to plan retaliation or confrontation. They were there to ensure everyone stayed alert and safe. The group included all kinds of people: young adults, older neighbors, families with children, and even those who had been hesitant in the past. Every person added to the quiet strength of the neighborhood. He noticed the strangers first from a distance. They were moving in small clusters, scanning the streets, their expressions unreadable. It was different this time. There was a sense of purpose in their movements, almost as if they were testing the neighborhood's readiness. The neighbors did not panic. They had rehearsed simple routines, watching in pairs, keeping children safe, alerting one another to unusual behavior, and maintaining calm awareness. No one acted aggressively, and no one stepped out of line. They simply existed as a presence, a living barrier made of attention, care, and quiet courage. He moved toward the group and shared a simple reminder: stay calm, watch, help each other. Nothing else is needed. We have done this before, and we will do it again, together. The group nodded silently. Their confidence was not loud, but it radiated through their posture, their gestures, and the way they kept a watchful eye without appearing tense. The children sensed it too. They laughed, played, and moved freely, protected by the invisible shield of attention surrounding them. As the strangers approached the main street, the tension in the air became visible. People instinctively moved slightly, without fear, but with awareness. Small groups positioned themselves in open areas, while others stayed near corners and alleys. It was not organized like an army. It was simply people paying attention, ready to act with care if needed. One stranger stepped closer to a group of children. But before anything could happen, a neighbor calmly and naturally approached, smiling, talking in a normal voice, and standing in a way that made it clear the children were safe. The stranger hesitated. There was no confrontation, no shouting, just awareness, confidence, and quiet human presence. Slowly, the stranger moved away. Another cluster of strangers tried a different street, attempting to walk past a row of houses where older neighbors lived. This time, the community had already anticipated it. Quietly, adults were present, checking windows, standing near doors, and keeping watch. The strangers noticed, hesitated, and moved on. It was a game of patience, of observation, of quiet strategy that relied entirely on human connection rather than aggression. The neighborhood was winning, without ever lifting a finger in anger. By late afternoon, the strangers had begun to realize that their intimidation had no effect. They had expected fear, avoidance, or chaos, but instead they were met with calm, attention, trust between neighbors, and children playing safely as though nothing could disturb them. Every attempt to unsettle the community was met with quiet confidence. He gathered the group in the square as the sun began to set. They spoke, quietly reviewing the day. No one celebrated with loud cheer. No one claimed heroism. They simply acknowledged that their ordinary efforts, attention, care, presence had made a real difference. Today showed us what we already knew, he said. Fear cannot control us. Care, attention, and unity can. We don't need to fight. We only need to notice, help, and stay together. That is our power. The neighbors nodded, understanding the truth in his words. The community had discovered that courage was not always about confrontation. Sometimes it was quiet. Sometimes it was calm. Sometimes it was about being present and acting with care when it mattered most. As night fell, the streets glowed with warm light. Families ate dinner together, neighbors exchanged stories through open windows, and children laughed as they played safely on the sidewalks. Even the strangers' occasional appearances no longer caused panic. They moved quietly, uncertain, and ultimately powerless in the face of a community that had found strength in human connection. The following morning, he walked through the neighborhood, noticing subtle changes. Windows were cleaner, gardens more cared for, sidewalks clear of debris. People smiled at each other more openly, offering small gestures of help, greetings, carrying items, or simply checking in. Every small action was a reinforcement of the unity that had protected them all. The strangers did appear sporadically, lingering at the edges of the streets or observing from a distance. But their presence was no longer threatening. The neighborhood had learned to handle uncertainty with calm vigilance. The focus was not on who was watching, but on who was present and connected. At the park, children ran in circles, older neighbors sat on benches, and adults walked slowly, casually observing the surroundings. The strangers paused at the park's edge, but then moved on, unable to intimidate a place full of life, laughter, and quiet strength. He realized that this was the moment the neighborhood had been preparing for, not a battle of aggression, but a test of endurance, awareness, and unity. And the result was clear. They had not only survived, they had grown stronger, more connected, and more confident. Neighbors began to help one another in ways that went beyond safety. They shared food, assisted with chores, and supported those struggling with everyday challenges. The community had discovered that protection and care were not limited to avoiding danger. They were about improving life together. Even the children seemed to sense the change. They moved freely, explored safely, and included one another in their games. The invisible threads of trust and connection that bound the adults together had extended to the youngest members, creating a sense of security that had once seemed impossible. By midweek, the strangers had mostly stopped approaching. Their attempts to intimidate or unsettle the community had failed completely. And yet, their presence had taught the neighborhood something valuable. They now knew the depth of their own resilience, the quiet power of attention, and the importance of looking out for each other without fear. He walked through the streets one evening, reflecting on what had happened. The story of their struggle was not one of drama or violence. It was one of ordinary people noticing, helping, and standing together. It was a story of courage that did not roar, but moved steadily, quietly, and undeniably. The neighborhood had become a living proof that ordinary human actions, patience, care, attention, could create extraordinary strength. Every door opened to a neighbor, every smile